Welcome back to the Career Now podcast. I'm your host, as always, Jed Lea-Henry. And on today's podcast, we have an incredibly interesting guest talking about a slightly troublesome or troubling moment in Korean studies community. And this is Robert Winstanley-Chesters. Robert, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you very much for having me, Jed. It's great to be here.
The pleasure is all mine. And we are going to get into a difficult moment for the whole community. But I want to start, if it's all right, by asking you about your regular research and your regular day-to-day life, because I've become slightly aware of it. And it is completely, what we're going to speak about today is a sidestep for what you normally do. So please introduce yourself and introduce your regular train of research, so anyone who listens will get an understanding of what you actually do day-to-day beyond this.
Yeah, so my name is, obviously, you know my name, but I'm a human geographer by trade. I did my PhD at the University of Leeds. My PhD dissertation ended up being called Ideology in the Production of Landscape in the Democratic People's Republic of Korea. So it's basically a historical geography of environmental management in North Korea. So I normally focus on the human geographies and historical geographies of North Korea. I did that. I published a book on, based on my doctoral dissertation, which is all about forest histories in North Korea and coasts, the history of coastal reclamation. And when I was there looking at the coasts off the shores of North Korea, I never really got a chance to go beyond the coast. And so I wanted to do my next project looking at fishing. So for the last 7 years, I've been working on fishing geographies and the geographies of fishing communities in North Korea, and I published a book for Springer called Fishing and Community in North Korea and Neighbors a couple of years ago, working on an update for that. So I work on sort of human geographies, the ecologies and environments of North Korea, and how that impacts sort of human life and sort of environmental things as well. I also work on geographies of the colonial period and relationships between German geographers, Japanese geographers, and geographers of colonial Korea in the way that they looked at research in the Japanese Empire, so particularly in Manchukuo. So I've got a bunch of stuff about that as well. So yeah, so that's what I normally do. I'm a human geographer. I teach at the moment. I teach human geography at Bath Spa University in the south of England. I also work for Leeds, and I'm actually a teaching fellow this semester at the University of Edinburgh, teaching Korean studies. So I've been teaching Korean urban geography in Edinburgh. So I end up in a lot of different places, basically.
Sounds like a lot to juggle as well. And so there's an article you published fairly recently, and it's called Authorship, Co-Production, Plagiarism, Issues of Origin and Provenance in the Korean Studies Community. And yes, this is as I said, a sidestep from everything you've just said there. So I think it's best to wind things back to the very beginning here and introduce this scandal in a way. So perhaps first thing, who was Charles Armstrong in his previous iterations? And what was the book, Tyranny of the Weak? So I might get us just briefly introduce those, and then we can jump into it.
Yeah, so Charles Armstrong is, I'm not sure what the word is a pretty famous professor of Korean studies, Korean history, at where he used to be at Columbia University in New York. He actually published a really good book in about 2002, 2003 called The North Korean Revolution, which is looking at the sort of historical threads around what came to be the sort of North Korean state and its politics after 1948. But then he published in 2013 this pretty powerful book called Tyranny of the Weak, North Korea and the World, 1950 to 1992. It was published by Cornell University Press. And it was really about North Korean politics and its engagements with other parts of the world and other sort of Cold War powers and communist powers, non-aligned powers as well around the world. I think it was published by Cornell University Press's Studies of the Weatherhead East Asian Institute. It was really popular. And it's a really it's a really nice book to read. Yeah, it sets out, I think, a really complicated set of stories in a really cohesive way. Yeah, which makes sense, which would make sense for any reader, really. I mean, it's academic, but it's not. Charles Armstrong had a really very accessible way of talking, an accessible way of writing, and he was a good presenter. You know what I mean? So it was it was really widely well received. It won lots of prizes, like the Fairbank Prize for history and stuff like that. So it was a big book in Korean studies, basically.
And it made its way into, I was reading your article, it made its way onto a lot of academic curricula as well at the time.
Yeah. I mean, it was along with another book from the same time by Andrei Lankoff, North Korea, I think, what is it? The failure of Stalinism or something like that. I can't remember the exact title of his book. And later on, Susie Kim's Everyday Life in the North Korean Revolution. It was really one of those sort of like new set books on North Korea, which really ended up on a lot of reading lists and a lot of curricula and stuff like that. And other people would cite them because they had really good, on the face of it, it seemed like they had really deep archival and source roots, and people were able to understand the sources and get first-hand accounts of stuff from these books, and so they were really important.
And then in 2013, the things begin to change, and as you write in your article, I believe it begins to change first with a review written by Brian Myers, and as you said, a very prescient article of a time, and I might quote what you have here and what Myers wrote back in 2013. It says, several pages unfold events and quotations in a sequence so similar to Balazs Salanty's Kim Il-sung and the Khrushchev era that one either starts or ceases to wonder why Armstrong was so reluctant to cite it. And I might get you to take us there with these first inclinations that things were beginning to go wrong. Yes.
So, I mean, people did pick up on that one. Do you know what I mean? I remember reading that reading that issue of Acta Koreana, and remember reading that article and thinking that was a particularly pointed thing to say. And also bearing in mind that, I'm also the managing editor of a journal, and I know how when you're reviewing and producing even things like book reviews, there's a certain element of peer review, and that will have been picked up by the editors as quite an assertion. And so Myers would have had to basically justify himself, essentially for saying this. So it was quite a thing to say, to say in academic print. So I remember it very much so from that. But it sort of, and as I say, it revolves around four initial things, which is basically about misattribution, of sources, where the sources might have been the sources that Armstrong is referencing don't appear likely given the date or the subject. They appear like they might be something else, and that something else, if you read Balazs Salanty's book, is essentially they're from a different set of sources. But the sources are almost like bizarrely wrong. Do you know what I mean? in the Armstrong book, you know what I mean? So in a way that it would be weird. Do you know what I mean? Like if you've done your research and you've done your proofing and your copy editing and stuff like that, you would imagine that someone as senior and someone as famous would pick up on it. You know what I mean? But anyway, so those were those first four things, that are first four elements of the book, from pages, what is it, 81, 105, 156, and 63, about misattribution of sources or sources in the wrong place. They were where it all comes from. So it's just early days, and the weirdest thing is it took a very long time to come out the next wave of the next wave of interest in this.
Yes, and I suppose we should mention at this stage, it's not uncommon for first drafts of books, even once published. I mean, people outside the academic community might find this strange, but first drafts of books, hardcovers, often have mistakes in them. Poor, not just mistakes of fact, but mistakes about attribution, and they're often corrected when it comes to paperback.
Yes, I mean, I've published a number of books myself, I mean, it's not that we don't pay attention as authors. It's the fact that often you're talking about hundreds of endnotes, hundreds of references, which you've accrued together over a period of like 5 years, they might have been in different languages, they're all from different places, and it can be complicated to get them all in the right shape for the final version of a hardback book. And also, proofing from some publishers is not what it used to be. Do you know what I mean? So in the past, like big academic presses would have proofing departments where they would literally interrogate every reference to make sure it was right. But these days, in our sort of neoliberal world, we don't have those large departments of proofers, and many publishers outsource proofing to interesting places around the world. My own book on fishing, the proofing was done by a proofing team in Chennai, in India, who didn't really have any experience in proofing Korean. So it came up with lots of interesting things. So so proofing and getting all of these things and getting all of the sources and references in order is complicated and doesn't always go right, and you nearly always miss things, and you correct them in the second version of a paperback.
So
it's not uncommon at all. No.
So Myers publishes his review in 2013. In 2016, he publishes, I think, as a blog on his site, titled "Revoking a Recommendation," which has those 4 points in it. And as you said at the time, these are really at this stage. There is a slow burn to this. There's 4 points, which is the problem. And yet, even at this stage, the Korean studies community is in uproar. Not about the claims of plagiarism, but about Myers' articles and Myers' criticisms of Armstrong, but also of Balazs as well. So I might get you to take us there.
So, the Korean studies community reacts with apoplectic rage, I think is not an understatement. And it's not just, it's about the fact that Armstrong is a highly respected character in Korean studies and, friends with many people, and has produced good work in the past, and is deeply embedded in the sort of infrastructures of Korean studies, if you like. But also, it's coming from, people, you presumably have talked about Brian Myers on your podcast before, coming from someone who is, by almost to the bone, a pretty iconoclastic contrarian, who has upended essentially thinking about North Korean ideology, in a way that nobody else has. Do you know what I mean? And challenged a lot of people's viewpoints and continues to challenge them. If you ever read his blog, The Steely Press, it's or Steely, I don't know how you pronounce it. It is extraordinary, and he is he's an extraordinary character for his. He's a polemicist in a sense sometimes. You know what I mean? He used to be a literary critic, and his review of Jonathan Franzen's, I think it's Freedom, is one of the most hilariously destructive reviews I've ever read in my life. So it's not just the fact that Charles Armstrong is highly regarded and well thought of. It's the fact that Armstrong is a person who doesn't make friends and doesn't have many friends. And also Balazs, for some unknown reason, is regarded, I guess, in a way as sort of peripheral, to the field, even though his book, North Korea and the Khrushchev Era, which is not the exact title, is brilliant. It's a brilliant book and equally good at dealing with the sources as any of the other books. But so there's a sort of collision between the seniority and respect for Armstrong, the peripheralness of Balasolontai, and the sort of iconoclastic polemicism of Balasolontai that just creates an outburst, a real outburst of rage, and it's profound. It's profound. I mean, it was done. It came out on the Korean Studies email list, the listserv. So weirdly, Korean Studies still has a rather old-fashioned listserv, almost like back from the days of Usenet and things like that, and which is very important for the Korean Studies community. So Brian Myers posted to that, or Jeel Kim, I think posted that. Posted the link on the Korean Studies list, and I mean it was a huge outburst, yeah.
Sorry, go on.
Yeah, and so many important characters in Korean Studies weighed in on the subject. You know what I mean?
Yeah. I'm trying to picture an image of the average listener who has no connection with Korean studies listening to this and struggling, as I first did when I started hearing about the scandal, to begin to think, what is actually going on here? So what was actually happening? So I guess I'll ask the naive question. It's also a hard question. What were they so upset about, these scholars? Because most people outside of academia have this idea that it's in academics' own interest to make sure that no one steals their work, no one misappropriates the work, and that their field is as accurate and truthful as possible. And yet here is a man, or two men showing that. And the attacks are, I mean, I might read a quote here, one of the attacks: no balls, no decency, no academic conduct. So this is very personal, these attacks.
Yes, they're very personal. I mean, so essentially, as you said, you know that in academic work, often with the first editions of books, there are flaws in the citations, which are corrected later. And so what you have is somebody who very few people respect and many people have a problem with, accusing somebody not of making these minor flaws, but of outright plagiarism, and somebody who's really, really respected, do you know what I mean, and important to the field. So you're basically, in the old style, you're questioning a gentleman's honor, you know, and that questioning of a gentleman's honor, really, I mean, yeah, it was a huge deal. I mean, so it's when I say gentleman's honor, I sound like I'm being flippant, but like, you know, it was something like throwing over the teacups in the common room, if you know what I mean. You know what I mean? So it was very personal. A lot of these people, you know, Armstrong was their friend, you know, and there's a network of things that you rely on each other for. So you know, you would rely, you know, maybe you would use Armstrong to review your book or to sign off on your project, or he was on a committee that got funding for particular things. And so, you know, to say this about him, it just destroys personal, professional, and working relationships, you know.
Let's move on from four. So all this heat and animosity is over four particular instances. But of course, as you spoke about, Balasolontai and Myers, you know, they're incredibly good historians. And they dig into this, and they start chasing down the citations. And when a citation leads back to some distant archive in East Germany, they begin contacting the archive. So I might get you to open up that space of the almost investigative work that Myers and Solontai began to do of this book, and how it began to unfold. That, you know, four instances didn't even begin to touch.
So very quickly, 4 becomes 16 or 17. So literally the next week, Brian Myers sends a list of 17 documents to a particular archive, that Berlin's political archive, 17 documents that Armstrong was supposed to have used from the East German archives, and the archives come back to him that actually only one out of the 17 documents exist with the similar catalog numbers that Armstrong used in the book, and that the one that does have the same catalog number isn't really about the same thing. But you know, so that 4 becomes 17, and then Zolontai and others, a number of others, use a series of open source Google documents to basically go through Tyranny of the Weak line by line, source by source, and to deconstruct the entire source history, if you like, of the book. And they come up with, after it was months of work, they come up with 98 instances, so 55 plagiarism where Tyranny of the Weak apparently used plagiarized material, but hid the plagiarism by fabricating a source. So he would hide the fact that he'd plagiarized a source by making one up. And then there were 28 cases where Armstrong had done plagiarism of a source, but then used an irrelevant source to cover up the plagiarism, like just reference something completely irrelevant. So it ends up with about 98 sources, and there must have been about 20 people working on this. Yes. So 20 people spent months doing this. So it was and it wasn't just from Armstrong. It looked like there were other people whose work was, paraphrased, if you're being polite. Yes. Armstrong is the only person whose work has, Zolontai is the only person whose work has ever categorically been proved to have been plagiarized by this book. But there are a number of other scholars who are also equally famous, whose work was essentially, to be polite, paraphrased by Charles Armstrong's book.
So let's dig into that little, again, I'm imagining people outside the community listening to this. Paraphrased keeps coming up a lot. And there's this, a lot of this comes back to questions of paraphrasing something. So I imagine people listening wondering, is 98 is a large number, but they're probably thinking, are we nitpicking here? How significant, how blatant is this plagiarism? And again, asking another question attached to it, if it was so blatant, why did Charles Armstrong think he was going to get away with it, do you imagine?
Well, we wonder,
Yes, wonder.
With the benefit of hindsight, we do wonder now, do you know what I mean? Because, it was, it's blatant, but only if you're a brilliant source historian, So it's very obvious if you're citing something which is in the Hungarian Foreign Ministry's archives, but you're citing it as from the East German Foreign Ministry's archives because you don't speak Hungarian and the source is in Hungarian, then that is blatant plagiarism to somebody who is deeply involved in this. Obviously, Balázs Zolontai is Hungarian, He obviously also speaks Russian. He speaks Mongolian as well as Korean. Charles Armstrong, we know, speaks Chinese, and his Korean apparently at this stage was not brilliant, and he certainly didn't speak Hungarian, So how could he possibly have used the Hungarian Foreign Ministry archives? Well, he couldn't. So to basically hide the fact that he didn't, because he borrowed Balázs's work. He invented this idea that he got it from the East German archive. So when I say it's blatant, it's blatant if you're really good at using sources. But perhaps if you're a member of the public, or you're a student, or you're an academic reading quickly, trying to set a syllabus, you wouldn't notice. You know what I mean? And the text of this book, as I say, and I would still say this, even though it's plagiarized, the text of the book is really coherent and really accessible. So it's good to read. Do you know what I mean? It tells a good story well. Do you know what I mean? It just uses someone else's work to do that. And it bases itself on this complicated archival history that ultimately Armstrong didn't really do. So, so it's blatant if do you know what I mean?
Yes.
So that, essentially that's why it's hard to, that's why I think he imagined it wouldn't be picked up. Because it's really complicated. And also he's very famous and very like an important scholar and has a certain sort of academic entitlement and privilege and stuff like that. And, you don't generally pick up on things like that with those sort of people.
So what was Armstrong's response to this? And you have a couple of very interesting quotes here. I'll read the second one, but in 2016, he says, "I've made errors and I'll take some responsibility," and then seems to point to the fact that it's only a few errors in a single chapter, perhaps only 2 pages or 3 pages. And then there's another quote from the same year, a couple of months later, and he says this: "For those who find the book flawed, inaccurate, or insufficiently researched, the answer is simple. Write a better book. I would look forward to reading it." And I bet you Blanche was reading that thinking, I did, right?
Yeah, exactly. It sounds almost Trumpian in its ballsiness. Do you know what I mean? It's like essentially gaslighting. We use the word gaslighting a lot these days. That's basically gaslighting. Yeah. So it was an extraordinary thing to say, but I guess he felt like he had a strong, he had strong response from his friends and and colleagues, and it was maybe not going to go anywhere. So who was going to listen to these funny little people working on this Google document? Do you know what I mean? And Brian Myers, who listens to Brian Myers? So that's why, I guess. I mean, it's with the benefit of hindsight, it's tremendously what, hubristic, I think is the word. So a very interesting response. And he actually, he had a blog at the time, and he wrote a very comprehensive piece, a letter about this. The blog has since disappeared. You know what I mean? So he was very, very aggressive about it.
What was the response of Columbia University? This is Charles Armstrong's university, and I think it was Cornell University Press, the publishers of the book.
So interestingly, Columbia took a long time to start a sort of investigation, and were reluctant to start an investigation, but they did. And that investigation runs on in the background for a couple of years, Cornell University Press were embarrassed, I think, embarrassed to the extent that they had to produce a second version of the book, which apparently corrected 52 things. But the second version of the book, they weren't embarrassed enough to say that they were so embarrassed they didn't actually say that the second edition of the book was the second edition. So a new edition of the book came out, still listed as the first edition, but with this tiny acknowledgement section in the one of the front pages, not on the cover, saying that Charles Armstrong is basically acknowledging the work of Balazs and Montai and is a bit embarrassed by this, and we've made some changes. Do you know what I mean? But they didn't. It doesn't. It's the most disingenuous second edition I think I've ever seen in my life. Do you know what I mean? You wouldn't even know it was a second edition. But in Charles Armstrong had won the Fairbank Prize from the American Historical Association for this book, and he had to give it back in June 2017. Yeah. So around the same time as the second edition comes out, he has to give the prize he got for the book back. So Cornell University Press, embarrassed, but not embarrassed enough to produce an actual proper second version. And Columbia start a very, very long running investigation.
Yeah, let's go to how long running that investigation was, because we're going back to 2013 when those allegations were first slightly raised, and 2016 when Myers digs into it, then I think it's September 10, 2019 when Columbia's Dean of Arts writes an open letter and effectively saying Armstrong did it.
Yes, it's 6 years later. Yeah, so in January 2019, the Columbia Spectator, the sort of Columbia University's newspaper, essentially published an article saying they're really, really worried about the lack of urgency on the subject from the university. And Professor Miyoshi Yeager, who is also a very important scholar, basically resigns from the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C.'s board because Armstrong is still on the board. So the Columbia Spectator flags this up in January, but finally in September, Maya Tolstoy, who's Columbia's Dean of the Faculty of Arts, basically produces a letter to staff, which basically says that, that Charles Armstrong is guilty. He's committed research misconduct, plagiarism, and he's going to retire at the end of 2020, and he's on sabbatical. So in England, we have this phrase about being put on gardening leave. Yeah, so he gets put on gardening leave, and basically until the end of his till he retires. Yeah, so it takes 6 years to come out with the reality, with the fact that he was guilty of it. Yeah, but the astonishing thing is how guilty he was of it. Which I think is another part of the story which we'll get onto now. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Well, that's the interesting part about all those interesting details here. But I think I'm going to have to ask just one or two little things first. What was the media like at the time? I don't think you included this in your articles. I think Myers wrote about it recently in one of his. Because the media and the reporting on this, because it seemed to be very quiet, the actual reporting of these things beyond. I mean, this is a massive academic scandal, and I'm not sure how far it was published. Maybe I'm not reading or listening to the right sources, but it appeared that this wasn't running across the airwaves of every university and national papers.
The only articles I've literally ever seen are by Khadija Hussain from the Columbia Spectator. I've never seen any other media reporting about this, apart from Retraction Watch, the sort of academic plagiarism and malfeasance sort of website. Yeah, so I've never really seen any reporting about this, and my article, as far as I know, is like literally the only article about this. Do you know what I mean? So there's been very little reporting about it, although we all know, I think, and yes. we all know, and we wouldn't. It's interesting to see that nothing really has come back onto the Korean Studies email list about this. Yeah. Because I mean, the Korean Studies email list is very useful, but some of the people who got the most set are the moderators of the list. Yeah. So not to cast aspersions, but it's unlikely that anybody writing about this in a positive way, like gotcha sort of way, would end up getting their pieces posted to the list. Do you know what I mean? Whether they did or not, I don't know. But like, there's been very little conversation about this in reality. This is something that people very much want to forget.
And before we get into some of those details about, co-authorship and plagiarism and what is not in this, I think we should just give one last point. And I wasn't aware of this until I read your article, of just how I think the phrase you used at one point was the erasure of Balazs-Salantai. And you write in this that after all this reporting, it appears that Armstrong had been plagiarizing Balazs all the way back to 2003. He'd somehow got his hands on Balazs's dissertation and had used his work a number of times.
Yeah, so I mean, it's really quite powerful what he did, to be honest. So I mean, the final report, which was partly posted to Retraction Watch, and the links are in the paper, says that I think it 61. So 61 of the examples of plagiarism, the possibilities of plagiarism in the paper, in the book, 61 examples were proved essentially beyond reasonable doubt. But more than that, it appears that Tyranny of the Weak derived from a series of draft chapters that Professor Armstrong had used to secure his tenure application in 2003. And that those chapters that he got tenure with themselves plagiarized Balazs-Salantai's own doctoral dissertation, from which Balazs's later book is based, and they actually found in his office a copy of the dissertation, a copy of the paper dissertation that he'd somehow managed to get from the Central European University in Budapest, where Balazs-Salantai had done his PhD. So essentially, the plagiarism wasn't just about Tyranny of the Weak; it went all the way back to 2003. And, Armstrong's application for tenure, which got him tenure in the end. which was breathtaking, absolutely extraordinary, to be honest. I don't think any of us would have imagined that it would have gone back that far. Really quite extraordinary. Do you know what I mean?
Yes. Let's get into some of those questions then. You begin your article a few pages in with what is necessary, a deep look into what plagiarism actually is. And you use a phrase which I haven't heard a lot used, and apparently I think you wrote, you used that, you appropriated it from your own field of human geography, and that's co-production. So I might open that up for us. And what do you mean by co-production in this way? And what are the various different ways that this kind of action can look?
Yeah, so I mean, co-production is a phrase or a word borrowed from sort of academic human geography, and it's normally talking about landscape and space and terrain, and how our relationship as humans with that landscape tends to, in the end, co-produce a new sort of landscape. Yeah, so it's not just humans that are involved in the production of that landscape, it's actually the landscape itself. Yeah. So other people have written more extensively about this. It's about there's a woman called Jane Bennett, a philosopher, who wrote a book on vibrant matter, this idea of vibrant matter. So material objects having their own agency. So we have this sense that the material landscape in human geography has its own agency, which sort of gets shared and sort of combined with the agency of humans, and together we produce a new geographic space. Yeah, and we may not even be really aware of it. It just happens by dint of both the non-material world and the human world being involved in a thing together. So yeah, so it's quite a complex term from human geography, and I think it's really relevant. It's really relevant for the sort of notions of authorship and plagiarism, in the sense that sometimes, and especially in Korean studies, when you might be working with people who who are Korean, who don't speak English, or their English isn't native level, and you might not speak Korean that well, and essentially in the work of working together, you end up basically co-producing a piece of work without really realizing it. So you're both sides of the conversation get sort of constructed into what you're writing. Yeah, and at that point, it's really difficult to say who's the author. Do you know what I mean? Are you both the author? Is one more of the author than the other? As a second primary author? So yeah, and so there's lots of that in Korean studies, not just about people who are literally trying to write a book or trying to write an article together, but sometimes like people who are translating the work of an author into Korean or into another language, or the wide translating it into English from Korean, basically co-produce a new version, essentially, of the book by them, or the writing by themselves. Yeah, and where authorship lies is really complicated. Do you know what I mean? And I think I bring up also like defector narratives and things like that. So sometimes defectors, North Korean refugees, whatever you want to call them, work with scholars or journalists to tell their own story. Yeah, but the refugees or the defectors, they're not professional writers. The journalist is the professional writer, or the academic is the professional writer, and so the story gets sort of constructed and co-produced in a way where the actual authorship becomes unclear, and sometimes that the story, the narrative from the North Korean side gets sort of like filtered through the lens of what's expected, yeah, and what's acceptable. So North Korean books, North Korean stories that are boring, like they just go to the shops, they couldn't get anything at the shop, so they went somewhere else. That doesn't really get written about, yeah. But things stories where terrible things happen, that's much more likely to get written about. So, people may end up projecting their story and telling their story through this lens of what is essentially acceptable, required, expected, and done so with a sort of foreign translator into English in a way that, so the story is a co-production, not just between the author and the translator, but also between the society that's receiving the book. Yeah.
So
is that
yeah.
clear?
Yeah. I was going to say, with that in mind and some of that that complexity there, let's talk about the Korean studies community as a whole and some of the history, because I was largely unaware of most of this. I thought the Armstrong affair was an aberration in the Korean studies community. And one of the most important things about your article, with what you've just said there in mind, and we can come back to those questions of co-authorship as we speak about this, go through a number of instances, and I might just open them up for you. I think the first one you talk about is way back in 1996, and this is Ja-hyun Kim Habush, I believe.
Yes.
She writes this book, or she publishes a book, which is a translation, of course, the memoirs of Lady Ha-young. And then 2 years later, I guess effectively the same book is published in Italian by a different academic. So take us there.
Yeah. So this all ends up coming to the fore, essentially, because the Habush ends up writing to the Academy, the Association of Korean Studies in Europe, who published the argument about this in their newsletter. So essentially, Habush, who is no longer with us, unfortunately, she was a very famous Koreanist scholar, basically translates this very complicated story of a princess, Lady Haegyong, and there aren't that many stories written directly by Korean princesses, so it's a very important book, and she translates it for the first time into English, but she actually makes some really interesting decisions in the translation. So she reorganizes the text and the different sections of the text to reflect the sort of narrative in the text, and she excludes different aspects of the diaries, which basically are not interesting or wouldn't be interesting to the reader, and she uses a naming strategy and a sort of Romanization strategy, which is kind of very much her own, and the Italian translation essentially claiming to work from a different version of the diaries, essentially ends up using exactly the same reorganization, and it also has the same omissions and extractions from the story, and it also tries to use the same Romanization style and punctuation style as Habush. So and of course the fact is the version of the diaries which he was using, the manuscript, the original Korean manuscript, doesn't have some of the things that he reorganized. So the elements of the text that Habush uses from a different version end up in the Italian version, which is supposed to be from a totally different manuscript. So essentially the claim is that this Italian author has basically massively plagiarized. Basically started not with the Korean text, but with the English translation by Habush. There's a very heated exchange of letters about this. This is the early 90s, so it's not emails or it's letters in the Association of Korean Studies in Europe's newsletter, which are very interesting because they don't just involve the two authors, they also involve the person, the publisher of the book, and again, the Italian author has a justification for the plagiarism, which is fascinating in its sort of ballsiness, if you like. So I'm going to quote myself.
Sure.
So the quote is, "She's right. I adopted the same 4-chapter structure she proposed in her version, but how could it be otherwise? During the translation, her book was on my desk like the Bible on the desk of a priest. By deciding to follow her structure, I meant to give credit to her work, recognize her scholarly achievements, and honor her long years of research." So fascinating. But also, you know, there are a number of different academic traditions around the world where repeating really often without acknowledgement is essentially regarded as paying homage
yes.
to a senior academic. Yeah. So so that is sometimes in some academic traditions that is actually legitimate. Yeah. But it's obviously become not at all legitimate when writing in English in a sort of Euro-American perspective. Yeah. But so that's a very interesting case. I mean, I actually use other cases. I wanted to talk about a case which is not in the paper, yeah,
please, yeah.
Which is from my own experience, yeah. So I'm the managing editor of a journal, and I won't name names here because it's sensitive, and the paper that I'm talking about never actually made it into print, yeah. So a couple of years ago, I was basically arranging the peer review of a paper by a pretty famous scholar who'd written a very famous book on a particular geographic topic relating to Korea, Sino-Korean relations, yeah? And in his book, he uses a very interesting translation for the geographic term watershed. So the term when you mean where the river flows down a mountain. So the point at which rivers flow to one way and then flow the other way in a mountain chain, that's the watershed across the mountain. And he uses a very interesting translation of the word watershed from Chinese, yeah, from Korean, in this paper. Now, I got a peer reviewer. I got a peer reviewer to review this paper, who I knew was massively inspired, who had massively inspired the author. Yeah. So I got a peer reviewer who I knew had been inspirational to the author of this paper, and I sent it to them. And they wrote me an email, a furious email, essentially saying that the academic, the paper that I'd sent them massively plagiarized their own famous book, which, for an example, uses that exact and unique word, that translation of that word for watershed, in a way that nobody has ever used before in Korean. And basically, they are the original author was Korean, the peer reviewer was Korean, and I knew that the author didn't speak Korean. So the author of the paper had essentially massively plagiarized their paper from an author that they actually, on the face of it, really respected and found really influential. Yeah. And you could see that because they'd used a Korean translation of a word which they couldn't possibly have translated themselves. Yeah. And so, those sort of things happen a lot. I literally in the last issue of the current issue of the journal, I peer reviewed a paper. I got a paper peer reviewed which paraphrased without citation the first 15 pages of a really, really profoundly important book on K-pop. Yeah, and unfortunately, I sent the paper to peer review to the author who the paper writer plagiarized. Yeah, so it happens a lot, and it's hard sometimes to tell whether that plagiarism is from or paraphrasing without citation is from a position of respect or homage, if you like, but because in some traditions it comes from that's where it comes from, but not in the European American tradition, obviously. So that's a really interesting example.
It just shows you how widespread some of this stuff is within the community. You touched on a fair bit there, the idea that you almost have to be the person being plagiarized to fully appreciate what is happening before you sometimes, because you're just being paraphrased, and paraphrase is not an easy thing to catch. It takes a lot of work. And
yes,
in your article, you go through some of these interesting details here, and I might get you to ask about archival research here. Because one of the ways we don't have to bring it back to Armstrong as much as we can, but in other ways, as in there's a heavy reliance on archival material, or at least in recent years in North Korean studies with the opening of certain archives, but also these archives are structured in certain ways, and when you access them, you leave traces and things like this, and it was almost the case simply by looking at what in the ways in which Armstrong had referenced things, you realized he couldn't possibly have gone to those archives. And you didn't have to read, you could always tell from the fingerprints he had left on his own references.
Yes. I mean, I sometimes feel like this is a bit like the way that when people have just basically cut and pasted all of their sources and citations out of Google Scholar, you can tell because they make exactly the same mistake that Google Scholar makes all the time. Yeah. So it becomes really obvious when you know what you're looking for. So yeah, the example you're talking about is Russian archives. Often, so I spent a lot of time working in the State Archive of the Economy in Moscow, and many Russian archives have this bureaucratic system, so that unlike American archives and European archives, where documents are basically stored as single documents normally, and you recall the single document piece by piece. In many Russian archives, the documents are stored often by the bureaucrat that was involved in making them. And so if a bureaucrat was dealing with a particular research expedition, for example, by North Koreans to the Far East in Vladivostok, all the papers about the arranging of the visas and what they want to do will be in the folder of this bureaucrat, but also all the other things they were working on, like who organized the biscuits for the symposium, that sort of stuff, who got the coffee, where do they order the coffee from? And all those documents are organized into separate folders, which are called fondi. And often, I'm not sure this is the case for all Russian archives, but for a lot of them, often the fondi they're a physical folder of documents. They have a sheet on the front, where whoever has recalled the item from the archive is recorded on the front. So which author, which scholar was it? What date was it? When did they give it back? That sort of stuff in the reading room of the archive. So you can essentially get a sense of exactly who was looking at a document, through a whole period of time. And that was one of the ways that it was possible to get a sense that Armstrong perhaps wasn't being entirely honest with his archival visits, in the sense that we got someone to go to those archives and look for the records on the front of the fondi and recall the documents to see whether he or somebody else connected with him within a certain time frame had looked at them. And of course they hadn't, because he hadn't, because it was Balázs Longtai had done it, So let's talk about that. Actually, this is fascinating. I guess I want to ask about how an academic field gets this way. I mean, I keep, as you was talking, I keep having these images of all these journals around, these Korean study journals, getting these papers presented to them that have if for nothing else, academic misconduct within them sometimes on large scales. And I wonder how this begins to happen. And you mentioned this a little bit in your article, the broader cultural scene, this post-truth era we're living in, this idea of truthiness. And you touched on North Korean studies before, and there's been a long running, understandable in some ways, approach to the testimony of North Korean defectors, for example, who give very important stories about North Korea, and then often, not often, but in some very significant and public ways, these have been fabricated, even if only in minor ways that have, partially fabricated.
Yeah, and often the response from the community, and you can understand this, is sure, it's not entirely true, but there's truthiness to it, as in it's a lie in furtherance of a truth or something along those lines. So how much do you think this plays a role in all of this big scene we're building up here?
So, I mean, I definitely think, I talk about this in the paper. I definitely think that when it comes to Armstrong, it was truthy, that he would have produced a book like this, yeah. That his ability to deal with all of these sources with such erudite ability was truthy in a way, yeah. So you would have expected it, yeah. So we expect that level of sort of source analysis from someone like that, and it just wouldn't cross your mind that wasn't real. You know what I mean? I also think that obviously North Korean sources and North Korean studies and Korean studies and lots of people complain about this, has become obsessed with really hard to find archives, yeah, and hard to access archives, which are really complicated for other people to get a sense of. So in a sense, you have to basically trust a lot of people, you know what I mean? That they said they found this document in this place where you're never going to be able to go, do you know what I mean? So you have to sort of trust them until the next person comes along and guarantee and sort of suggest that, oh yeah, that's definitely there, I found it, do you know what I mean? And so as a field, the archives are very complicated to visit. Often North Korean archives are impossible to visit, yeah? So we have to access our North Korean sort of information and sort of archival information from all sorts of random places, which are sort of tangential in a way often, do you know what I mean? So I was in the Russian State Archive of the Economy, looking at the records of the Soviet and Russian North Korean Joint Fisheries Commission, yeah, which obviously the North Koreans constantly would talk about every now and then in their state media, but I never imagined that they would ever publish the documents. But the Russians have them in their archives. So if you want to get this perspective on fishing relationships between the Soviet Union and North Korea in the 1970s, you have to go to Moscow and look in this archive, do you know what I mean? And there are other places like the Chinese state customs statistics and things like that, where this is the places you get these sort of information from. So it's a very archive-heavy field. It's very difficult to access those archives. Often they're paper, you physically have to go there, you know what I mean? And the access can be very difficult. The Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, who's famous for translating and digitizing the archives, a couple of years ago had this very long research exchange with the Myanmar National Archive in Rangoon. I'm trying to look at what Korean information was in the archives of Myanmar. Obviously, that is not accessible anymore, and it was hardly accessible then. Apparently, and I got told this by one of the people on the trip, apparently they'd basically changed the law so the archives were open, and they'd appointed a chief archivist so to enable people to visit it, but they hadn't written any frameworks or guidance about what the person should allow foreigners to look at. So when these people from Washington, D.C. went to the archive in Myanmar, the guy was perfectly friendly, but he basically said, I have no idea what I can give you, so just get the documents you like, show me, and I'll tell you when you can have them or not, and he just made it up on the spot, So our field's relationship with archives is, it's part of the energy behind the field, but it's also very problematic, yeah, because it allows people to make mistakes or to deliberately do things like this, but it also is a barrier against entry for younger scholars and people with less funds and things like that. So it creates lots of problems of its own.
So I'm just as the last few questions on this, to bring it back, though it is so interesting to me. How much do you think, although we have touched on this a fair bit there, but as you've been speaking, I've been thinking, how much is this the behaviour of Charles Armstrong as an outlier in the community? Clearly, as you said, he's not an outlier, but how much is he himself, do you think, a victim of a broader culture here? I mean, you are not just a North Korean studies culture, as you touched on here, but a broader academic culture, as you touched on a few times. You mentioned a few times in your article the extraordinary pressure to publish within academia and things like this. So how much are these kind of academic cultures going to produce Armstrongs and errors of this kind?
Well, I mean, actually, in the report from Columbia University, they actually say that the fact that he was under loads of pressure is not an excuse. So they don't think he was under. I don't know whether they think he was under that much pressure, or they just don't think it was an excuse. But so in around the world, we live in a publish or perish situation as academics. You're only as good as your last paper, and if you don't get a paper published every now and then you won't get a job. In many Korean friends I have, their job contracts are tied directly to the number of articles they publish each year. Yeah, so it's publish or perish, and that can create immense levels of pressure to publish and to find something new, find some new spin on a subject. And I could conceivably see how some people would cut corners, and maybe adopt somebody else's work, or co-opt somebody else's work as their own, or like paraphrase a little bit here and there. And I mean, as the managing editor of a journal, I actually encounter that at least once or twice an issue. Yeah, so at least once or twice an issue, I get a paper submitted to the journal which has an issue of plagiarism, and it's embarrassing. Do you know what I mean? So I mean, we don't publish those. Obviously, those never get published. Yeah. So I think we catch a lot, and the peer review process catches a lot. And I think generally people are honest. Yeah. While there is a lot of pressure, and some people can just, find a way of rationalizing it to themselves when they're under that pressure, that this is okay. Do you know what I mean? I think most people don't do this, but I think some people do, and Armstrong did, not just once, but all the way back to his own tenure file. And we all know how valuable tenure is. So you know what I mean? And people who are senior, they have a certain sense of entitlement and a certain level of academic privilege, not white privilege or whatever, but academic privilege. And they don't expect to get caught. They don't expect to get called out on things, So Armstrong is one of those. Is a nail sticking out as an outlier. Do you know what I mean? But I think also the whole situation depended on the emotional work, not the emotional labor, the labor of a lot of people to unpick it. Yeah, so you have to find enough people to basically do the work to unpick it and to just keep going. Yeah, and it took a lot of energy, and I mean, I know, but it hung over Balach's life for many years, and was very, very stressful,
Yes. And that's one of the things I think often is missed in this, is that there's a human being paying a massive price for all of this.
Who really paid a very large price emotionally, I think, I mean, I know Balach quite well, and so, it was hard to see happen. Do you know what I mean? And
of course the pressure. I was going to say
great. Sorry.
No, I was just going to say the pressure. How do you think? I mean, he stood up to the pressure. There was a lot of pressure. You mentioned the backlash from the Korean studies community, but a lot of that pressure was simply saying to him, "Shut up," and it'll be in your interest to shut up, right? And he must have had. I don't want to put words in his mouth, but he must have had moments when he thought, perhaps I should just shut up and get on with my career.
I'm sure he did. Yeah, I'm sure he did. I mean, believe me, I had lots of thoughts about publishing this paper myself. Do you know what I mean? So, and what this would do to my career publishing this, because to be honest, I know all of the people involved. You know what I mean? And I met Charles Armstrong a few times myself. So, this paper won't have won me any friends. It won't have won me many friends in some places. But I thought it was very important to do.
Well, as a last question then, on that, with a slight look to the future. And again, we touched on this a little bit already. One of the most important things about your article, and one of the things that we've sadly brushed over, is the amount of work you go into talking about co-production and what plagiarism actually is, and all the difficulties of attribution. And you write, I'm going to quote you here: "We must find new ways of incorporating and regularizing notions of co-production in order to better protect against malfeasance and plagiarism." You go on to say, "One of the wicked problems of our academic community is the myth of the heroic archive hunter and author." So as a last question here, what do you think? I mean, you sit on the board of a very important journal, and you've seen these things come again and again, and you realize that there's a challenge here within the culture of it all. So is there a way to begin to change the institutional arrangements of the Korean studies community so these kinds of incidences don't come up as much as they have in the past?
Well, I think I actually talk about this in terms of, in the paper, in terms of data. Yeah, so the traceability of data is very important in sort of web development and like development of online resources, because the data has to all, none of it has to be corrupt. Yeah, because if a piece of data is corrupt, then it basically ruins people's systems. Yeah, so it would be great if there was a way we could work, where we embedded like an acknowledgement of source and references and the origin of our ideas in the text. Yeah, through sort of file when we share files and that sort of stuff. And so that could come out as sort of traceability, like almost like a blockchain style thing, you know. And so I think that idea is very interesting. I'm not a tech person. I mean, I'm all right at tech, but I'm not like a coder. Yeah, do you know what I mean? So I think that could be really an interesting way of guaranteeing that text or source that you've found yourself and that you're going to use yourself and other people might want to use. I think that might be an interesting way of basically making sure that people get the credit. Yeah, do you know what I mean? So that's something for the future, I think. I mean, I think it's inevitably hard in a field which for many, is focused on a place which for many places around the world is far away and costs a lot of money to go there, and whose archives and materials about the space are very disparate and spread all over the globe. Yeah, and so inevitably cost a lot to get to. So I think if we could think more about how to fund junior scholars to do their research, to enable them to access these archives and share digitally. I mean, I love the fun of a physical archive. Do you know what I mean? I like nothing more than sitting in the reading room of the Russian state economy. What is it? State economy archive. I like nothing more than sitting in the reading room. Yeah, in Moscow. With the complicated bureaucratic processes. I love it, but the digitization of that is a way to basically reduce the entry levels and the barriers to that sort of material. Benjamin Young, who wrote what did he write? He wrote Guns, Guerrillas, and the Great Leader. I just got the book out of my bag. Guns, Guerrilla, and the Great Leader. He's published by Stanford. He has a lot to say about the fact that North Korean studies and North Korean studies is the notion of the archive hero, and the fact that is really makes it very inaccessible to lots of people. And maybe as a discipline, we need to think about the funding to basically make it so that other people with less funding or less position or less higher up in their career, like Armstrong, can get access to this and make it more crowdsourcing and public availability of that stuff would reduce this tendency to sort of like borrow from other people, to be polite, quote unquote, borrow.
I mustn't sneak in one last question just briefly here as we leave this off. I might get us to tell us how it all ended for Armstrong. He was stood down, of course, but I might get you to just explain how it all ended there. But I guess much more importantly, what I'm thinking about is you, as you say, you're deep in the Korean studies community, and you saw the poor behavior of many of your fellow academics. And I wonder, since Armstrong has been punished, whether you've seen any kind of reckoning within the community. I mean, people often change their minds and their views silently behind the scenes, and you might have access to that. Do you have you noticed any kind of reckoning behind the scenes within the Korean studies community?
I wish I had another answer for this, but the answer is no. I haven't seen another reckoning. So I feel like the people who feel that Armstrong was unjustly punished still feel like he's been unjustly punished, and they don't really feel like he did anything wrong. You know, even with the reports, yeah. So I haven't seen anybody apologize. Do you know what I mean? And I don't expect to. So which is profoundly disappointing. You know what I mean? It was very disappointing to. It was very disappointing in the first place, and it's been disappointing the whole way through. Do you know what I mean? So I wish I had a different answer to that. Sorry.
No, it's fine. Well, on that disappointing note, I
don't like to end on a disappointing note. I'm sorry.
No, it's fine. And it is a good place to end the podcast on, because it is, like I said at the start, a troubling little moment, a significant moment in the whole Korean studies community.
Yes.
So the article we've been speaking about today is called Authorship, Co-Production, Plagiarism, Issues of Origin and Provenance in the Korean Studies Community. I, of course, am going to link it below, as well as I think I'm going to link some of those Google documents and archives that Balazs and Myers began to bring together, explaining the full details of the plagiarism. And I will link below places where the listeners can go and read Robert's day-to-day work, his regular work on human geography in North Korea, and expand it there as well. Robert, it's been such a pleasure. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me, and thank you for the opportunity, really, honestly.